everyone, and welcome to episode 42 of What to Think, VentureBeat's weekly technology podcast. I'm Dylan Tweeney, the editor of VentureBeat.
And I'm Jordan Novet, one of our writers.
And we are here in the San Francisco headquarters of VentureBeat, recording with our new podcasting kit. I'll tell you about that sometime. This week, we're going to talk to Joel Spolsky, the founder of Fog Creek Software and Stack Exchange, and lately Trello. We're going to ask him about all these things. But first, here's some tech news highlights from VentureBeat.com. Let's start with Pinterest. In the last week or so, Pinterest banned all affiliate links. Things like, Amazon affiliates and what have you. They're saying that these are spammy. And they were asking power users, if you're going to monetize your Pinterest boards, you've got to do it in a different way. Harrison Weber had the report on this, and he thinks that this is the first sign that they might be moving towards their own kind of monetization plan.
They've been doing promoted pins as one attempt to basically sell ads.
Yes.
And the affiliate link concept was what Harrison called an experiment. And on top of it, there was a report a little while ago that Pinterest would launch a buy button along with Stripe. And so clearly Pinterest is trying to gradually start to generate more and more revenue off of all those pins and boards that people are supposed to be putting up on Pinterest.com.
It would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? I mean, because the company has this enormous database of things that people like and want enough to save. And it seems like it would be very easy for them to convert that into buy this.
And not only that, I think from a user-based perspective, it's not just women who are using Pinterest as everyone thought it was a few years ago.
That's right.
Actually, it's diversifying more and more. And the information that Pinterest knows about all those users is quite interesting because it shows what people like and want, not just the random thing they're talking about on their Facebook posts. For example, I think it's going to be one way or another Pinterest needs to monetize.
Could be
Everyone
huge.
knows it.
In the short term, though, the power users are a little pissed off because they aren't able to use their affiliate links like they're used to.
That's right.
Speaking of pissing off people on social media, let's talk about Facebook. Now, this is a really interesting story. Daniel Turdeman on our staff did this piece. Do you want to summarize it, Jordan?
Well, I understand that it is specifically something coming up with Native Americans who use one name
right,
and actually go by another.
Well, no, they actually use their Native American name, but
okay.
Facebook thinks it sounds fake. Like somebody named Dana Lonehill was the one at the top of the story.
Right.
But, you could have other names like, John Creeping Bear or something like that. And Facebook
Dana
thinks
Lynn Lone Elk is what she had put.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Facebook thinks that that's a violation of its real names policy.
What is up with that? Why are they doing that?
Well, the thing that really gets me is that it seems to me that, they solved this problem last fall when a bunch of drag queens were saying, like, look, I want to be called, Sister Rosa or Little Miss Hot Mess or whatever. And Facebook was like, okay, that's fine. You can be that.
And there were more gender options as well for pronouns.
That's true.
They're moving in the right direction, but not quite there, it seems like. What was Facebook's response to all of this?
Every time it comes up, they basically say, oops, that was a mistake. I suppose they mean well, but my feeling is that they don't have the infrastructure in place to handle people with lots of different kinds of names. And when push comes to shove, or in sort of in the daily mix of things, whoever it is at Facebook that's responsible for enforcing this policy wants you to have a very traditional, regular sounding name.
Yeah, I'm not too down with that. What I will say is it's sort of part of Facebook's modus operandi to have a lot of users, where it's just what has happened.
Yes.
More than Twitter, more than Pinterest, like we were just talking about.
Yes.
And so they're going to be hitting the walls of real names, I guess, if that's what they insist on, more than Google Plus, at a greater rate than the other social networks that aren't as big and don't have as many users with all these sensitivities.
Well, just compare it to Twitter, right? On Twitter, you can use whatever name you want. You can make up a name, and Twitter has no concern at all, which on the one hand is nice because that gives you the freedom to, use a pseudonym.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, it's caused swarms of trolls to overtake certain sectors of Twitter and makes it very easy for people to act in abusive ways because there's no consequence. Their real-world identity has no connection to what they're doing on Twitter. So there are definitely pros and cons to Facebook's policy. There's no doubt.
The interesting commonality between Pinterest's situation with the affiliate links and Facebook with its real names is finding truth for users. What is the person's real name? And it could very well be that the original name that this person used, Dana Lynn Lone Elk, is the name that she feels is right. And let that be, even though Facebook thinks that's questionable.
That's right.
I think Pinterest is trying to do the same thing. They don't want to pass spammy stuff onto their users. But maybe there's a thin line between what users say that looks strange but is actually legit,
yes,
and what's spam. It's hard.
I will say this, Facebook needs to open its mind a bit about what counts as a real name, and it needs to increase the variety of options that it lets people use to legitimate their real world identity. Because it's not enough to say like, oh, you've got to send us a driver's license or
birth certificate.
I mean, they actually say library cards are okay, but they still approach it in a very bureaucratic way.
Twitter would never do that.
No. But let's move on to something from the enterprise world. You had a really interesting story a couple weeks ago about Pivotal and how it was going to step back from its distribution of the big data storage platform Hadoop.
That's right.
And then just this week, the other shoe dropped. They kind of confirmed your scoop, didn't they, Jordan?
Well, I would think it was a matter of time because Pivotal is not nearly as talked about when it comes to what distro a company uses to store and process all of its different kinds of data, whether it's machine logs, server logs, or social media mentions, tweets, what have you. And I think it's a matter of aligning with the spirit that all these pieces should be available under open source licenses.
Yeah.
It's more proof. We're seeing more and more. Intel dropped its Hadoop distro last year.
Yeah.
And I think this is a more big picture recognition for big data that if you want people to use it, it needs to be in open source.
Yeah. Well, so open source is one thing, but they're not exactly stepping away from Hadoop. They're just sort of open sourcing their distribution, but they're also working with Hortonworks.
That's right. They're going to support it.
So there's a sense that they might be, not dropping it per se, but preparing themselves to back slowly away from their distribution of Hadoop.
They're open sourcing key bits. Greenplum was a big asset that they got from an EMC acquisition some years ago. And Gemfire, they have talked about a good bit, but it's clear if it's not out there for everyone to use, maybe that's not the best piece. Open source databases have gone in this direction. Aerospike is one example that happened last year. I think this is what will happen more and more going forward, even Microsoft. I mean, people understand this concept.
The open source concept.
Yeah,
that's right. Microsoft itself is open sourcing key parts of .NET and other aspects of their infrastructure, which is something you'd never think Microsoft would do in the old days.
I'm happy about it because it's free and people can build on it.
Yep.
And a lot of people use it, not just a few customers here and there.
Yep.
If you want an answer, it's much better to just go to the community.
That's right.
Where there's a lot of other people just like you.
I mean, I think the other thing that Pivotal has recognized is it can't invent and own every single part of the stack.
Yeah.
In some cases, there may be a, best-in-class version of something, Hadoop, for instance, that comes from another vendor. And they need to be able to support that, right?
We'll see what happens next. Pivotal has a platform as a service. The Cloud Foundry is what they are building a bigger community around.
Yes.
And I imagine that will continue to grow, but bundling, as they did, Hadoop and their platform as a service, which they pitched me on a couple of years ago, it seems like that wasn't quite the best approach. If you want this, you go for this. If you want that, you go for that. Maybe, do you want this? Do you also want that? That might not have been the best way to go.
Yeah.
And should be in the open is basically what everyone is seeming to acknowledge here.
All right. Well, Jordan, good job staying on top of this story. For all this and more tech news, you can go right to our website, VentureBeat.com. Now, before we go to our guest, Joel Spolsky, I have a message from our sponsor. The What to Think podcast is brought to you from, well, actually, this week it's from the offices of VentureBeat, but it's brought to you by our sponsor, New Relic, which helps customers make sense of billions of data points about millions of applications in real time. More than 250,000 people leverage New Relic's comprehensive cloud-based solution to analyze more than 690 billion points of data per day, coming from more than 4 million application instances. New Relic provides powerful insight into your overall environment, from the web to native mobile apps and more. And you can learn more at newrelic.com. And now let's talk to Joel Spolsky. He's the CEO of Stack Exchange and the co-founder of Fog Creek Software, which you may know as the makers of Trello, which is this hot to-do list app. Spolsky actually started his career at Microsoft many years ago, where he was a program manager on the Excel team, started a blog called Joel on Software and wrote it for about 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. That actually got turned into a number of books. And now he's joining us on VentureBeat's What to Think podcast. Thanks for joining us, Joel.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Jordan has talked to you a couple times for a couple stories. So why don't we start with Trello? Tell us where Trello is at these days.
Oh, boy. Okay, so you called on a good day. Trello just hit 7 million accounts created. It is growing faster than anything I've ever seen or involved with. Since Stack Overflow, at least, we're adding about... Now, I think the rate we're adding people is about 110,000 new people per week coming onto Trello. So it really is a fantastic hit.
How old is Trello now? How long has it been out?
That's a good question. About 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
Not very long. Who knows? Everything seems so long when you're as old as I am.
So one of the things I really like about Trello is it's got a very kind of fun visual, like you're pushing index cards around almost kind of thing.
Right.
That's based on the...
I guess I should describe what it is, because even though there are 7 million users, that probably implies that there are about 6 billion non-users. And 1 or 2 of them might be listening to this podcast.
So tell me where the inspiration from Trello came.
The idea, we were looking for something for me as the manager at Fog Creek to understand what anybody was working on, because we had all this detail information. We had these bug tracking databases that had lists of hundreds of things that everybody was supposed to work on. And they were all neatly prioritized and sliced and diced and estimated and so forth. And, I could always just sort of assume everybody must be working on the highest thing in their priority queue. But it was still very hard for me to get a grasp for an idea. And usually if I walked down the halls and went into everybody's office and said, hey, what you working on? I would come up with, 3/4 surprises. And a lot of times I would discover that people were working on big projects that were not that important and not working on things that I thought were important.
Right.
I kept saying to the manager of the dev team, can you just put some Post-its on a whiteboard somewhere that tells me what everybody's working on now? 1 or 2 things that they're working on, 1 or 2 things that maybe they want to work on in the future. And I started coming up with this idea for, can I make a software program? If anybody wants to do this, by the way, you can have this idea. And it would be called 5 things. Mm-hmm. And each person on the team would be able to list 5 things. And that would be 2 things that they're working on right now. And you could have 2, even though I'm normally against multitasking, because your main project, you might get stuck or blocked or just bored and want to switch off with another project. So you could have 2 things that you're allowed to work on, 2 things that are queued up that you're going to do next. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have those, you can sort of go around and say, hey, what should I do next after I finish this? And people can give you suggestions. And then 1 thing, the 5th thing, that you promise never to work on ever. This is like the thing that I'm not allowed to work on. We're never going to do it, but it keeps coming up for some reason. So let's just put it on there. I will blatantly advertise that I'm not going to ever do that, that thing that you want.
Now, let me just ask you something, Joel.
Yeah.
I'm not sure at what point it happened. Trello became open to having as many things as you wanted to put on there. How and why did that change?
I continued searching to see, is there something out there that does this? And I came across Kanban boards, which shouldn't have taken me that long to find, because we had a perfectly acceptable Kanban board implementation right in FogBugs that you could use if you were into Kanban boards. And a Kanban board is, let's just call it sort of a narrower and much more constricted way of doing things than Trello. In a Kanban board, you have these columns, vertical columns, and every card is sort of a feature that you're working on, or sometimes people call them user stories. It's just a thing that you want to do. And each column is a state. And the leftmost state is, we just dreamed this up yesterday. And another state might be, we finally decided to do this. And the next state might be, this thing needs some design. And the next state might be, this thing has been designed and is now ready to be implemented. And the next state might be, this thing has been implemented and now needs to be tested.
So things kind of march from like column to column as they get
and they work from left to right. Yeah. So for example, let's say you're a tester. You go in every morning and you look in the column of things that are done that need to be tested, and you pick one of them and you test it. When you're done, you drag it over from the needs to be tested column to the ready to be deployed column. And then the person who's the deployment manager comes in the morning and he looks at those things that are ready to be deployed and he deploys them all, or she. So that's the theory of Kanban, I think. And one of the neat things that happens on Kanban boards is that if you're piling up inventory somewhere, you notice it right away. An inventory might be, hey, we got an awful lot of features that are just waiting to be tested. That column now has 126 things in it that are done that are waiting to be tested. And so anything that's blocking features from getting to your users is going to become visible on a Kanban board because some column is going to start, stuff is going to pile up. It's almost like if you had an assembly line in the factory, remember Lucille Ball, and there's just a big pile of chocolates accumulating in some room.
Joel, let me just clarify something. I was under the impression that at Fog Creek, you guys had gone out to 8 developers and said, hey, we want you to team up in teams of 2 and come up with new products. And Bobby Grace and Justin Gallagher were the ones who put together the prototype. Was it your idea originally, or was it their idea?
I guess that speaks to what innovation is and how many people it takes to actually come up with an idea. Mm-hmm. But let me finish this. Whose lie is this, Jordan? Let me tell this story. This was what I discovered about Kanban boards. But this is, again, Kanban boards were not invented by me by any stretch of the imagination. I sort of thought, hey, we could do a better implementation than anybody else is doing. And then I went one more step, which is, if we can make this flexible enough that we don't require that the columns mean anything, you can use whatever columns you want, then people will use this for all kinds of stuff. And they'll find this to be a useful way to manage all kinds of interesting projects. If we can just make this super flexible, like not a lot of constraints, sort of like when you open word processing document application type thing, you just get a blank sheet. When you open a spreadsheet program like Excel, you just get a grid. It's just, and that was the idea, of give you a nice blank sheet that you could construct any way you wanted to. That was as much of an idea as I had.
Yeah.
And I did have one other idea, which is that I don't know whether the other Kanban boards had really implemented this, but I had this idea that on the back of the front of the card, you just have a title that explains what it is. I had this idea that you could click on the card, it would flip over, and on the back, you'd have room to attach all kinds of little things there. Like you could attach files, you could link it to things that you're doing in version control, you could put pictures, you could have discussions and conversations, you could add a checklist of what items have to be completed for that card, and all kinds of just interesting, fun stuff that you could store on there. And even just with the files, the idea was, this becomes a self-contained project that marches through your organization. For example, it may go from design to specification to implementation to testing to deployment. And as it moves, it carries with it all of its documentation. And so when the person needs to deploy this feature, when they look on the back, they see the design, so they know what it's supposed to look like. They see that it's tested. They see the test plan, so they know that it's been tested. Everything is just in one place. So that was the extent of my ideas, and I drew that on maybe 2 or 3 sheets of grid paper. At the same time, we were doing this kind of innovation project at Fog Creek. We took 8 developers and we said, divide up into 4 teams of 2, spend a week or 2, come up with some idea for something, and start to implement it. And let's see how it goes and where we get. And there were a couple people on that team that I persuaded to do my idea of what became Trello. And I just basically drew this out for them and said, you guys go ahead and figure it out. They went off and they spent not very much time and very rapidly got another one of the teams to join them. So suddenly there were 4 people on the team. They really liked this idea. And they just started building it. And the truth is that was kind of 95% of my total involvement in Trello to this day was just getting them started. And most of the good ideas that are in there are sort of the hard work of the people on that team.
So, Joel, it sounds like it comes very much out of your needs and Fog Creek's needs as a development shop. Do you think it's now evolved beyond that? Is it still primarily used by programmers and developers?
I hope it's not. In fact, one of the things that we did, because we had this experience of making FogBugs before, and it was a developer tool and developer product, and people would tell us, this could be used for life. This could be life bugs, and people can use it to keep track of, everything they need to fix in their house. And part of the problem was that it was a little bit too... The terminology was very specific to programmers. So there was in FogBugs there was all this programmer jargon to make it fun for programmers. Like for example, the idea that there's a milestone, which is just a word that programmers use in scheduling, and it's there because programmers use that word, not because anybody else uses that word. Although. Anyway, we knew that this was sort of limiting the market for FogBugs to the world of programmers, and we wanted Trello to be useful to anybody that's managing any kind of project. And in fact, it turns out that it's useful for a lot more than managing projects, which is neat. As of today, I think we're calling it an electronic whiteboard or computerized Post-it notes or something like that. We came up with actually the team of 4 people. It was Justin, Bobby, and then they added Daniel and Brett pretty quickly. Came up with a set of sort of major design guidelines that would be, I guess you could call them the axioms of what it means to be Trello, even before they started building Trello. And some of them were implementation details. For example, one of the principles of Trello was that it should scale from any device. You should be able to use it on your phone, and you should be able to put it on a big screen, 60-inch plasma monitor on the wall that everybody can look at. And so it should scale seamlessly up and down.
And that was a principle from the start, you're saying?
Yeah.
That's amazing, because it actually does work like that, right? And I mean, it doesn't feel like the mobile experience is tacked on or anything. So that's very interesting to hear.
No, and in fact, we were very, very careful to make sure, like, we didn't ship until we had at least a decent iPhone implementation. We got an Android implementation pretty quickly. And we just wanted people to understand that, our very first demo video, even before we were shipping, I was literally dragging cards around on a phone, and it was appearing behind me on this gigantic wall of monitors, where we had this huge wall with 5 gigantic plasma monitors that were arranged next to each other that was just showing a single Trello board. And as I was dragging things on my phone, it was sort of instantly moving. Then that was sort of the second principle, is that you'd never have to think about syncing or saving or anything like that. Everywhere a Trello board is open, it's always showing the exact same state as everywhere else. So if I change it on my phone, it instantly changes on every other web browser that's open to that Trello board, like instantaneously. There's no process of like, I will save and then you'll update it, or like, do you have the latest version? Let me send you the latest version, or any of that nonsense from the Microsoft Office era of document management.
Right.
Trello was always like super ultra synchronized.
And I think that's really important, and the rise of Google Docs definitely proves that it's a good idea to give the latest information to everyone who's using a document.
Right.
But I wonder how Trello is being used now that it, as you tweeted out today, there's 7 million users. What are the craziest implementations of Trello that you're hearing about? As a co-founder, I know you're not the CEO, that's Michael Pryor, but what are those crazy uses? And I wonder if you think Trello will ever be named enterprise software.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely enterprise software. The truth is, I just made fun of Office, but it's really used more like Microsoft Office in the sense that everybody makes a lot of boards, and it gets used everywhere, and it's sort of used for a lot of different things. And a lot of times people will start doing something in Trello, and then it won't exactly work the way they want, and that board will get abandoned, and then they'll try something else in Trello, and that'll work really well, and everybody will pile onto that board. And so it does very much spread within an organization and get used all over the place. It's not exactly enterprisey in the sense that it's like Salesforce, where you have one install for the whole company, and the CIO has decided to purchase it, and all 3,000 people are then trained on how to use it. It's nothing like that. It's more like just a bunch of people start using it, and it's kind of gets spread around. And the largest Trello board you might have 100, 200, 300 people on it, because that's the most people you would ever have collaborating on a single thing, but you might still be using it with thousands and thousands of people in your larger organization.
It's not ever going to have the feature bloat, though, that Excel, for example, had, I'm sure.
Not really sure.
You really put him on the spot, Jordan.
Yeah, no, I don't know if feature bloat is even a thing. I wrote a big article explaining that feature bloat is just sort of giving people the features that they want, and they don't really care if a feature, as long as it's not in their way.
I've been using Google Docs and working in WordPress primarily for the last couple of years, and I had occasion to work on a Microsoft Word doc today, and I was it really hit me how those kind of toolbars and menus are just like immensely complicated by comparison. So
yeah, the design principle that we have in Trello is that whenever we have something that we don't think 100% of the people are going to use, we call it a power-up and we turn it off by default. And so there's a section you can go into in Trello called power-ups, which you'll find it's there somewhere. And it's just a menu of a bunch of cool, exciting things that you can turn on that you may or may not need. And we'll add more of those as time goes on. But
what are some power-ups that are coming, Joel?
I can't speak for the team as to what they're going to do. But there's one power-up I've wanted for a long time.
And what is that?
Give you an example. The ability to put a number on every card and then get the sum of those numbers for each column.
Okay, why is that important?
I don't know. One way I would if you're using Trello to keep your sales pipeline, and the columns represent your deals that are at different stages, you could use that number to indicate the size of the deal, and then you could see, oh, look, I got a total of $75,000 that are about to close. And you would see that sort of instantly, and you could just put a number in each card. And that's an example of something where, somebody could write that in 5 lines of code, right? A little bot that did that. And you wouldn't want that to be getting in the way of everybody who doesn't need that feature.
Right.
But on the other hand, wouldn't it be cool if you go into the Power-Up section in Trello and see hundreds of cute little cool power-ups you can do. The current power-ups we have a power-up for voting, so you can vote on cards. So if you're using cards in some way, like I use them with my family to plan our family vacations, and everybody tries to find a whole bunch of houses on Airbnb and VRBO and HomeAway that we could rent. And we put them on there, and then people can vote by clicking vote which house they want to go stay at. But most people never use that feature of Trello, so it's in a power up. Another example is what we call pirate mode, and that lets you cause cards to start to look old and yellowed and crinkly, like a pirate map, if you don't touch them for a long time. So you can go into a board, turn on pirate mode, and everything that hasn't been touched for a week will start to yellow. And if it hasn't been touched for, I think, a month, it'll get even worse. And so that will remind you to look at each card.
That's a hilarious feature.
Yeah, and obviously there's lots of things you wouldn't want that on, but I use that. I have this board that's called CEO Reports, and it's where all my reports report what they're working on, and actually every team in the company at Stack Exchange reports using that board what they're working on, and they're supposed to report once a week. And so I go into that board, and I look and I see which cards are starting to look like pirate maps, and I call up those people, and I yell at them. That's my job. It's easy.
Cool.
CEO. Yeah.
It's a nice visual cue of what needs to be updated or what has been updated. Or hasn't been.
A lot of times in project management systems, things will just get sort of like trapped, like caught behind a rock in the stream.
Right. We've spent most of our time talking about Trello, but you mentioned Office a couple times and Microsoft. And I wonder if you want to give us some perspective on where you think Microsoft is or how they're doing these days, because it sort of seemed to me, from my perspective, for a couple of years they weren't really competing very well against the completely sort of cool web world that Google and Apple
they
and Facebook
sort of messed up on cloud, search,
mobile,
social, mobile.
You could list a lot of things, but now it seems like they might have a few more cool things going on. So I don't know. Is Microsoft turning the corner, or how do you feel?
I think they have. Yeah, they definitely have. Are you kidding? I don't want to individually blame Steve Ballmer by name. That wouldn't be fair. However, because Steve Ballmer did actually grow the company quite a bit. But
he did.
It really helped the company when he left, because he was probably the reason why Microsoft was not paying attention to social, cloud, mobile, search, or at least they weren't getting it right.
Yeah.
I think Satya has all the right intuitions about how to do things, how to engage the community at large in a way that, even Apple does, and they're the most, cloistered company in the world. Even in Bill Gates' day, Microsoft had this bizarre form of sort of non-invented here syndrome, where it was very hard for them to recognize that they had to work with other companies that were already out there being successful. And that's just over. I mean, Satya has turned that around completely. And I think what was happening at Microsoft, and I know some people internally, and I've had these conversations with some people that work there, so I don't know how much of this is true, but you used to get the feeling that there was a group of people at Microsoft that knew what the right thing to do was, vis-a-vis open source, vis-a-vis social, vis-a-vis Facebook and Twitter and other companies, vis-a-vis startups, just sort of their whole stance towards Silicon Valley and the rest of the technology industry. There was a group of people that knew what the right thing to do was. And you could always tell them because they had an iPhone and they had to use it. But they did have iPhones, and they might have had Macs, and then sometimes, in fact, depending on how brave they would bring their Macs into meetings. But it sort of went along with their pink hair and their whatever other rebellious things that they were doing. But they would just sort of show, hey, look, I'm smart. I can get away with this. The trouble is that there was also a group of people, sort of the middle management backbone of Microsoft was all beholden ultimately to their careers and their desire to eventually move up the ranks in Microsoft, and they saw which way the winds were blowing there, and those people essentially would always kind of quash anything that sounded too much like Steve Ballmer might not like it.
Yes.
So there was this sort of backbone of, let's say, political people at Microsoft that whether or not they knew what the right thing to do was, nevertheless, they continued to allow that company to just sort of do the wrong thing. And the change that Satya has made is he's essentially said the top is now flipped. The top of the company is no longer, I don't know what the right word to use is. Let's just say it's not as sales-driven. It's a lot more technology-driven, right? And open to social, mobile, cloud, and et cetera, and open source.
Even Satya is using an iPhone now. Maybe it's not his primary phone, but he definitely has one.
He's not throwing chairs across the room. And then, so what that means is that instantaneously, all those people that are trying to climb the hierarchy are now a force for good and not a force for evil.
Yes.
And that is going to completely turn the company upside down rapidly.
That's very interesting.
Because it's not just one person at the top, ranting and raving. It's that the people at Microsoft always wanted to do the right thing. They just weren't politically allowed to until they were. And when they are,
right.
I think you'll see amazing things coming out of Microsoft.
Right.
Joel, I wanted to ask you something that's about the opposite end, which is startups. I looked at your angel list page and I noticed that you've invested in a couple of startups, one named Memoir and another one named Lore.
Yes, amazing companies. Oh, sorry, Laura's already closed.
What happened there?
Yeah, ask me someday to tell you about the only venture capitalist who was banned from attending Y Combinator demo days. And I'm not going to name him. But Lore, at some point, when they still had tons of money left, the VC suddenly decided to turn on the founder and close the company down.
Oh.
And it was absolutely horrific. And it's the most unethical thing I've ever heard of happening in my life. And for that and other reasons, that particular VC is the only one that's not allowed to even attend Y Combinator demo day. Normally what happens is Y Combinator, they let everybody go and watch the demo day, and they just tell the companies who the good VCs are and who the bad VCs are.
Unfortunately, we hear that kind of story, maybe not to that extreme, but we hear that kind of story all too often.
You know what? I can say this, and that's not necessarily about that story, but I hear a lot of stories. And one of the stories that I often hear is the independent board member switcheroo trick. And the independent board member switcheroo trick is in the first round of funding, an investor invests in a company and says, here's what we'll do. We'll have the board be 3 people, me, you, and we'll have an independent. And then they say, okay, and that sounds right. And then at some point, the investor says, you know what? If you're having trouble finding an independent that's mutually agreeable, whatever, we don't have to do that right now. It's not required that we have an independent right away. We can always find an independent later. For some reason, it's always the investor that suggests this, and then the entrepreneur always goes along with it. And then if I'm involved in that company, I always say, don't fall for that. Go get an independent right now. Because what then happens is that there's a disagreement, and the investor realizes that they want to force something to happen. And when there's no independent, there's nobody to block the VC who has the decisive, with a preferred vote or whatever.
Yes.
In the absence of an independent on the board, there's nobody to overrule the VC. And then at that exact moment, the founder, who's just about to get pushed out of his company or have his companies or her company stolen from him or her, or in some other way get pushed around by the investor, then says, oh, well, let me go find an independent now. And then they discover that they need the investor to approve the independent.
Yes.
Which the investor will never do.
It's too late at that point.
Always fill your independent seat. If you have one that is not filled, that is a trick that is being perpetrated on you by an investor who wants to control your company or wants to just kind of keep that option open. And, if I hadn't seen this like with my own eyes, but by people that I literally told to fill that seat. Anyway.
Everyone listening, let that be a lesson to you. That's a scary
Why don't
story.
people just listen to me?
Before we end, I just wanted to ask you one last thing. As a devoted and loyal Trello user, I want to see offline access come to mobile phones. And I wonder when that's going to happen, Joel.
We have people working on it as we speak.
Wow. Ask and you shall receive, Jordan.
That's a super high priority, and we're actually working on it. We got a little bit stuck. The iPhone thing hit a little app store snag with in-app purchase, something or other that stalled the whole mobile development process. Thank you very much, Apple. We fixed it, but it took them forever to, I guess, allow our app to actually get updated on the Apple Store. And that has been fixed finally, and the new version of Trello is now available on the App Store. This one doesn't have complete synchronization. Offline use is sort of complicated because when you get back online, if you've made changes and other people have made changes, then you need some way of deciding which one to keep.
Yeah, they could conflict.
Yeah, and sometimes that results in a conflict user interface where it's like choose this or that, and then we have to, now somebody has had to create we probably will never have that, but we can sort of synchronize. Maybe it's just like the last one in time wins or something.
Yeah.
We'll definitely work on that. That's a well-known thing.
Great.
Yeah.
That is unfortunately all the time we have to talk with you, Joel. This has been really fascinating. I wish we had twice as long.
Yeah, we'll have to talk more often, Joel. I'll have to bug you about Trello and Stack Exchange and Stack Overflow more very soon.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on VentureBeat's podcast. We'll talk to you again soon, I hope, Joel.
It's a pleasure. Bye now.
And thank you for joining us for What to Think, VentureBeat's Technology News Podcast. As always, you can find us online at VentureBeat.com, and if you haven't subscribed to our podcast in iTunes or Stitcher yet, please do so. Just search for the term What to Think, and we will see you online at VentureBeat.com. Until next week, I'm Dylan Sweeney.
And I'm Jordan Ovett.
Catch you later.
Bye.